Hey everyone, welcome to this video. Today we will be looking at GraphQL and how to use it within React using the Apollo library. And to do this demo, we're going to be utilizing the GraphQL API provided from GitHub. And in a previous video, we had created this very beautiful pie chart here showing the languages I guess work with most frequently according to my GitHub profile. And we had hard-coded the data for this one. So in this video, we're going to be pulling sort of my real fresh data from GitHub. And at the end of the day, it should look, I think, close to identical to this. But if you're following along, you can plug in your own GitHub account and you can see which languages you work with the most. So let's just quickly go over how this code worked here, and then we'll talk about changing it. So we'll just pull up our code here. And this is a Create React app that starts with the index file and renders an app. And let's actually crank up the font size for everyone. Boom. All right. So we look at the app, and what the app is doing is it's simply importing a hard-coded data file right in here. And then when the app component mounts, it's putting that into the state. And then down here, we've got our render function, which has a little bit of styling going on. And but what it does is if the repository's data is in the state, it renders a top languages component that receives that information and then produces the pie chart. And we don't really need to go into this function here because there's a previous video that I'll link to that talks about how we created this pie chart and how we sort of massaged the data that comes from the GraphQL API that GitHub has to get it in the right format for this pie chart. So if you're interested in that, looking below for the link on how to do that. Okay, let's get started. So what we're going to be doing is using a tool called GraphQL. And GraphQL allows you to basically interact with or play with GraphQL APIs in a nice interface. And I recommend this before you sort of dive in and start working with Apollo and whatnot in React. Just get comfortable with how it works. So here we've got our GraphQL endpoint set up. This is provided by GitHub, and it's basically the URL you have to talk with to use their GraphQL API. Over on the left here, we've got the query that we're working with. Make this a little bit bigger. And if you haven't worked with GraphQL before, there's a great website. What is it called? Learn GraphQL or Try GraphQL. Oh, shoot. How to GraphQL. If you know nothing about GraphQL at all, I recommend starting here. It talks about sort of the concepts behind GraphQL, how it works, how you structure GraphQL queries and whatnot. And then you can actually see how you do it with React and Apollo. And then if you're going to be implementing the backend as well, how you do that portion of it. So howtographql.com. All right. So here we got our GraphQL query talking to the GitHub API. And what we're doing is we're saying, I want to do a query and I want information about the viewer. The viewer in this case is me. It's the current user that is authenticated to this GraphQL API. And for this user, I want to grab the repositories and I'm going to get the last 100 of them. But I don't want to include any forks because those aren't repos that I really own. They're just ones I maybe forked and may or may not have actually worked on them or not. So this is just repos that I actually started. With the GitHub repository, anytime you're sort of dealing with anything that can return potentially multiple pages of data, what you do is you ask for the nodes. And those are sort of in this case, the actual repositories. And there's something else, I believe it's called edges, where you can sort of get information about like how many records there are, what page are you on, how to ask for the next page and things like that. But we actually want the information about the repositories we're asking for. So for each repository, this is the information we're going to grab. Its name, its description, and a URL to it. And then we want to grab the languages used for this repository. And again, this is something that returns multiple. So we can say that just get us the first 5 languages used for each repository. And again, because it's multiple, we have to ask for the nodes or the actual languages used. And for each node, we want the color and the name. So if we execute that query, it should just reload the same thing I already had open. But the beautiful thing about GraphQL is that the data comes back exactly how you ask for it. So you can see here, I wanted the viewer, okay, it gave me it. I wanted repositories, then I wanted the nodes, so the actual repository, individual repository details, and that was an array of repository nodes. And we asked for the languages, and we asked for those nodes as well, and it gave it to us here, the color and the name. So this is just, in this case, some Ruby exercism examples I was doing, and obviously since it's Ruby, the languages I worked with were Ruby for this one. But some other projects I have, this is a gem I built for translating, managing translations in Rails. It uses a bunch more languages. So this is how to ask for data from the GitHub GraphQL API. And if you haven't worked with Graphical before, you can actually click over into the docs and you can see like what queries can I, or how can I interact with this GraphQL API. So we'll click into query, and here's where you can sort of, if you scroll down, you can see that you can ask for the viewer, which is a user. The type of data is a user. And these are all the things you can ask for the user. So one of the things I can ask for, if I go scroll down to R, are the repositories, which returns me this sort of thing that has the nodes like I mentioned, or you can ask for edges or total count, just other information. But for the nodes, each node is a repository, and here's where you can see what information you can ask for each repository. So that's why I was able to ask for, where's N? M, the name, which is the name of the repository. So there's tons of information you can ask for on each repository, and LMNOP, so languages. Here we go. So that's how I knew I could ask for the languages of each repository. So if you get Graphical and type in this URL here and type in this query, you're going to get an error. And that's because how does GitHub, how do they know that who is the viewer? I haven't told them anything about myself here. So you actually have to send an HTTP header to make that work. And the header you need to send is one called authorization that has a value of token and then your actual token. And I'll show you how to quickly get that. If I pop open my GitHub, you go into your settings for your user and then down to developer settings. And then it's got one called personal access tokens. So here you would just generate a new token. So you'd write a description for video, and you could say what access you want this token to have. So I just want it to have info about the repo. So you generate that, it displays it once, you can copy it and then use it in your project. So that's where I got that header that I was using in Graphical here. All right, let's get to the actual React side of things. So what I'm going to do is add 4 packages to this project. And so we'll do yarn add. So we want one called Apollo Boost. We want one called React Apollo. We want one called GraphQL tag and another called GraphQL. And we'll just wait, and I'll explain as this is loading what these are. So Apollo is sort of the front-end library behind how like the code that interacts with GraphQL. And it works with many different environments like Vue and Angular and whatnot. So that's why we say we want the React flavor of Apollo. And it comes with sort of many different libraries that you can piece together to get it working the exact way you want to. But Apollo Boost it's almost like the Create React app of GraphQL. So that comes with a bunch of libraries sort of pre-configured to get you up and running easily. And I sort of recommend using this until you need to go beyond what it allows you to do. GraphQL tag is a little library that allows you to write GraphQL queries. And then you need this library even though you don't really import it anywhere, because it's a dependent, it's a peer dependency of, I don't know which of these, maybe all of them over here. So once we got all 4 of those installed, we're going to open up this app again. And we've got these here. Great. So we need to start configuring Apollo Boost. And what we're going to do is we're going to go into our index here. And our sort of top level component, we need to wrap that in an Apollo provider. And if you've ever worked with, I guess, React Router or Redux or MobX or any of them, you're used to providers. And we need to wrap one of them around this app here. And that allows us at any child level sort of down the tree to perform GraphQL queries. So what we're going to do is we're going to import, first we're going to import the Apollo client. So import Apollo client from Apollo Boost. And this is where we need to set up our client. So we'll do const client equals new, I believe it is. And what you need to give it is the URI. So we come over here and we'll copy it. Sweet. And we're not out of the woods yet. Remember that for the GitHub API, we had to actually send custom headers so that we could authenticate our user. So there's a way to do that with the Apollo client. And I'm just going to pull up the documentation actually. So here's the Apollo Boost documentation. Oh, I've been writing too much Ruby. There we go. All right. So we get a new Apollo client and we want to add in a request option. So we'll add a comma there and request. So it takes an asynchronous arrow function. And here's where you can modify the headers that get sent out with each HTTP request to the GraphQL API. So we're not going to pull it from async storage. What we're actually going to do is first we'll put this in backticks because we need it to say token. And here we are going to embed our actual token. And it's not a good idea to paste your token right here into the code because now that's in your GitHub repo, so everyone would have access to that. But it may change from different environment, like your local to your production may use different tokens. So what you can actually do in Create React App is access an environment variable. So the way you do that is process.env and then the name of the environment variable. And what Create React App allows you to do is to have an environment file sort of with a suffix of the environment that you're working with. So .env.local. So this is my environment variables for my local environment. And here you can put your environment variables, but you need to start them with React app underscore. And then the name of the token you've got here. Slacks doesn't bother us more. Okay, so I'm just going to make sure I have the correct token. I might have changed it. Edit that. All right, so React app GitHub token. So we'll copy this, and now we can use that here. So when Webpack compiles this code, it's going to go grab this token and it will basically replace this with the actual token. And I think we're good to go. I'm not sure if it needs to be a capital A or not, but I guess we'll find out soon. So now we have a client. We need to use this client to create a provider and wrap that around our app here. So we'll import Apollo provider from React Apollo. Like that. And now we can wrap Apollo provider here. Save that. And we just have to give it the client that we created above. Okay. So if I load this now, it's not done yet, but it should at least load without crashing. So I guess we're about to see how that goes. All right, loading, loading, loading. Yes, thank goodness. All right. So it's not using GraphQL yet, but it's at least not failing. So now that we've basically given our app the ability to make GraphQL queries or mutations, sort of any level below this provider here in the component tree, we can go into the app and convert it to use a GraphQL query. So why don't we actually get rid of this data that we no longer need? So we don't need this state, we don't need component did mount, we don't need any of that stuff. And we'll have to come back and fix this later on, but we're at least moving in the right direction. So the first thing we need to do is we need to import GQL from GraphQL tag. So this is the package that we use to write our GraphQL query. And we'll put it in a variable. So we'll say here, we could say repositories, like that. And we'll do GQL, and then you actually say backticks like that. And then you paste your query in here. You write it if you haven't already written it. So we're going to come back to Graphical, copy this query, and paste that in here. Okay, so this is the query we want to perform. Now, how do we actually tell Apollo to perform this query? The way you do that is we need to import another library. And this is a query component from React Apollo. There we go. And now what we can do is come into here and put our query component inside of our code. So we'll actually put it below the H2 here. Add some spacing. So query like that. So you need to provide the query component, the query that you want to run. So we called it repositories with big letters like that. And this one doesn't take any special variables in, like sort of dynamic data that needs to be changed. Maybe changed as our state changes or whatnot. But here's where you would sort of pass in any dynamic variables that you want to send to your GraphQL query. So once we got that, what goes inside of this query component? And what goes here is basically a render prop. And what that is we're going to embed a function that receives data from query, and it's our job to basically render something out in this render function prop. So what do we receive? We're going to use some ES6, I forget the name of this thing, destructuring, that's it. And what we receive are two variables. There's actually more information, but the ones we're going to work with are data and loading. So data is all of the things that the GraphQL API returns, and loading is a Boolean flag but whether it's currently fetching data or whether it's finished or not. So now that we have that, we can basically come down here and start to mimic this switch, or not switch statement, ternary sort of if statement, about whether to display loading or about whether to render the pie chart that we have. So what we'll do is we'll just say, okay, if it's loading, let's just do the same sort of span thing. I am loading your data. Okay. Otherwise, meaning we have the data, we want to render our top languages component. Like that. So we'll get rid of our old code, no longer needed, except that the repository's data doesn't come from state anymore. It comes from this data variable provided to us from the query component. So we'll access the data, and then I believe it would sort of be the same as it comes back. So data here, we access our viewer, and then the viewer has repositories. So data.viewer.repositories. And if everything works, we should be able to refresh. Can't really see it much, but it says I am loading your data for a second. And now this data is coming from GitHub instead of hard-coded using the GitHub GraphQL API. And I'm not sure if this will work or not, but let's see. So if I refresh this, does it tell me? All right, scratch that. There is a Chrome extension that I've had some issues with, but if you can get it working, it can show you information about which queries you are executing. But it's not going to work for me today, but that's fine. So if you come down here to Network tab, you can actually go and see the GraphQL query it's performing. Pop open this, and we'll switch to XHR. And here. So here you can see that we are making the request to GraphQL. We're sending that authorization token over as a header. And what we're getting back is the data with the viewer, with the repositories, etc. And because it was in the exact same format that I was using in my hard-coded example from before, I have to change nothing at all about this pie chart for it to work. So I can actually now clean up this sample data, delete that, and because we weren't using it at all, it should just work fine. Cool. So that's it for today, and I'll just quickly, in 1 minute, review what we covered. We talked about the libraries needed to use GraphQL in React, and they were Apollo Boost, GraphQL, GraphQL Tag, and React Apollo. And then what we did in our index file here is that we set up an Apollo client, and we configured it to use the URI for the GitHub GraphQL API. And then we modified each request to set the correct header that we need so that GitHub knows who we are. Once we had the client, we imported Apollo Provider, set up the client, and wrapped that around our app. And that allowed us to come into here, define a GraphQL query, the same one that we were playing with in Graphical, import the query component, and then use that down here inside of our app. We provided it the query. We didn't need any variables in this case, but then we gave it inside of here as its child a render prop function, which received data from the response of the GraphQL query and a Boolean of whether it was loading or not. And then we simply did a ternary to decide whether to display a loading spinner, or, well, loading text, or the pie chart that shows the top languages I use. That's it. Down below in this video, I have a link to an article to see a written version of this, and try it out with your own GitHub account. Hope you enjoyed it. Take care. Bye.